Sarcoma Stories is a podcast created by Sarcoma Foundation of America to highlight the voices and experiences of patients, survivors, and care partners. After listening, be sure to join our Sarcoma Stories podcast Facebook group to connect with the community and discuss the episode. Follow us and enable notifications on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss new episodes. You can also find all episodes and information on this subtype or your subtype on SFA's website, curesarcoma.org. Links are in this episode's description. On this episode, we speak with SFA Director of Europe Strategy and Engagement, Pantziarka. While Pan is an incredible staff member at SFA who supports SFA's global work, he also has a sarcoma story of his own as a care partner to his son, George. After George was diagnosed with 3 different primary cancers and passed away in 2011, Pan quit his job in the corporate sector and found work in oncology. He is committed to making a difference using everything he can: scientific training, advocacy, and a demand for change. He speaks to us today about rare cancer predispositions, such as Li Fraumeni Syndrome, the story of George and his mother, and why knowledge is power. Pan also shares where he personally finds hope as somebody who both has a sarcoma story and works in the oncology space. We are so lucky to not only have this conversation with Pan, but to also have him on the team at SFA, striving for answers for sarcoma patients and their families. Thank you, Pan, for all you do for the sarcoma community. Let's dive in. Welcome to Sarcoma Stories, and welcome back if you are a regular listener. My name's Tasha, and I'm one of your hosts.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brandy, and I'm your other host.
And today we have a special episode where we are joined by one of our amazing colleagues, Pantziarka, and he is our Director of Europe Strategy and Engagement. So I'm going to let Pan give a more thorough introduction, but we're so excited to be joined by you today, Pan.
Thank you, Tasha. I'm a bit nervous to be here, to be honest. So I am the part of SFA that is not in the United States. I'm in London, where I was born and have lived all my life. I used to be a data modeler. I worked in the corporate sector for a long time, but then my life changed and I became involved in oncology, and eventually that turned into working in oncology, working in sarcomas particularly, but it's not a turn of events that I had ever kind of imagined happening. But I feel like my life changed in a way and I wanted to make a difference. And this is one way of making a difference. Working for SFA, working in patient advocacy, working in research is a way to make a difference. And I think given what I've been through and what my family's been through, making a difference is the number one priority for me.
Thank you for that introduction. I'd love to talk a little bit about what was the catalyst for that change. I think this is obviously where the beginning of your sarcoma story is, and you have a story as a care partner to your son, George. So could you tell us a little bit, before we even get into George's sarcoma story, could you tell us a little bit about George?
Yeah. So before I talk about George, I have to talk about George's mum, Gina. And after George was born, he was our second child. About a year later, she became ill, and she was pretty healthy, never had any kind of health problems, but she became ill, and in the space of about 2 months, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. It was widely metastatic by the time she was diagnosed. She went into ICU, and then just before her 30th birthday, she passed. There was no history of cancer in her family, no history of cancer in my family, and it was just absolutely shattering. You're going to shock. I mean, I was completely unfamiliar with how oncology works. The whole thing was like being picked up and dropped on another planet. And at the end of that process, I had 2 children. Luckily, I've got a big family. I've got siblings, I've got my parents, and kind of everybody pulled together, but we were kind of like bereft. And then, about a year later, George, he was 14 months when his mum died, suddenly developed this bump on the side of his face. And at first it just looked like a bump. He was a little kid who was running around, he'd fallen, but this bump wouldn't go away. And it was not the soft thing, it was quite a hard lump, and it just got bigger. We took him to our local hospital, who said, we've never seen anything like this. And eventually we found ourselves in a cancer unit. And on his second birthday, he was diagnosed with a rhabdomyosarcoma. And it was like this bizarre thing that he was on this little trike running up and down the corridor in the hospital, and the nurses are there with a birthday cake with 2 candles. And I'm in a room with a doctor saying, how can he possibly have cancer? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's got to be something to do with what happened to his mum. And the doctors kind of shook their head and said, no, don't be silly. She had ovarian cancer and he's got a sarcoma. There's no possible connection. It's just incredibly bad luck. That at the time you just accept it. I mean, it didn't feel like bad luck. It felt like there was a connection to us. But then I was back in cancer world, back on Cancer Planet, and rhabdomyosarcoma, it's treated with quite intense chemo. He had surgery. We went through all that. Then he was in remission, and thought, okay, we can relax, we can go home, it's done. But then where the scar was, I could see that it was getting a little bit fatter and it didn't look right. And I went back to the hospital and said, look, there's something going on here. And I was actually called a paranoid parent. But it turned out that I wasn't a paranoid parent. It was a local recurrence of the rhabdos. So then we had more chemo, more surgery, and this time radiotherapy on top. So by that point, George was 4 years old. He'd been in and out of hospital for 2 years, but we were out the other side, we hoped, except after everything had finished, they did one more resection. There was still something there in the margins, and they said, okay, it's not gone. There's nothing more that we can do. Effectively go home and prepare for the worst, which we just refuse to accept. I mean, it's hard to accept when you've got this 4-year-old who's just an incredibly happy kid and full of energy and full of life, and we just couldn't accept that this was the end. So we switched to a different hospital. Everyone was preparing for the worst, but actually it went, nothing happened and nothing happened and nothing happened. And we started to kind of feel really hopeful that despite the margins, that nothing else was going to happen. And we had a fantastic number of years where everything was fine. There were a couple of scares, but nothing ever developed. And so past the 10-year mark, we thought, well, we're finished. I had gone back to work. I had remarried. Life was back to normal, and I wanted to forget that cancer had ever happened to our family. And then when he was 15, we noticed something on his skin, on the side of his face. That turned out to be a basal cell carcinoma, which was excised, and then we breathed again. Okay, it's excised, there's nothing there, we can go back to normal. And he developed a problem with his lip. It was tingling, something odd going on, and we kept going backwards and forwards to doctors trying to figure out what was going on, because it clearly wasn't right. And eventually, after a few months of different things, he went to a dentist. He took an x-ray and said, you need to go to hospital right now. And it turned out that what he had was actually an osteosarcoma of the jaw. And at that point, then, he'd had 3 different cancers, and he was finally tested and discovered to have what's called Li Fraumeni Syndrome, which is an inherited mutation in the TP53 gene, which is the kind of anti-cancer gene. And so our assumption then became he must have inherited that from his mum. So that would explain why he got his cancer at the age of 2, and it would explain why he had all of these other things happen to him. And then even at that stage, George was just such a fantastic kid. I mean, he was incredibly funny and quite naive in lots of ways, given everything that had happened to him. Just a wonderful kid, but that we had some really tough times because none of the treatments were effective. We traveled from the UK to other countries to get treatment there to see if that would make a difference. Nothing did. And he passed just after his 17th birthday, and that was in 2011. You know, it just changes your world completely. You expect that parents will outlive their children. It just seems so cruel when the children go first. And then in recovering from that, that was when I decided I needed to make a change to my life, because George's life had to mean something. Now, I already had a PhD, not in biology, but in computational biology. So I could do genetic models and things like this. And when George's treatment started to fail, I was making contact with different doctors in different countries. I was reading the literature and trying to learn and understand things. And I discovered drug repurposing as an idea. And, you know, I literally threw myself into trying to learn as much as I possibly could to save George. You know, obviously I couldn't, nobody could. But at that point, I decided to kind of put those skills that I developed to use and started working in oncology, in drug repurposing initially. And that I was doing that on a kind of voluntary basis, then a part-time basis. And then I moved completely from the corporate world, where I'd worked for a research foundation in Europe, where I worked for a long time, and I still work with them part-time. But you know, I focused on drug repurposing as an idea in general for all cancers, but also really wanted to work on sarcomas, and that's been the key driver. So that ending up working for the SFA is in some ways the kind of ideal endpoint for me to be actually working in a sarcoma foundation.
Yeah, well, Pan, we are so lucky to have you here at SFA, and not just the knowledge you bring about sarcoma and oncology, but the connection you have to it as a parent, as someone who has actually walked this journey with their son. You bring so much to the table, and we're just so lucky to be able to learn from you and work alongside you. And I really appreciate you sharing all of that about Gina and George. I always wish I had the opportunity to meet the people our guests talk about when they talk about them in hearing their story. And I know it's a lot to have to go back and to talk about them, but I hope it also helps make it feel like they're very much still present. And I know in the work that you do, you strive for that, but make their, like you said, make George's life mean something. But I hope in talking about them with us here, it helps them be even more present. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that.
Thank you.
I also wanted to ask, as you were talking, you're talking now from a standpoint where you know so much about sarcoma, you know so much about oncology, and you mentioned that they told you about Li Fraumeni and you mentioned TP53, and I'm imagining for our listeners who maybe don't know all of those things, like when you were in the experience of receiving that information, how much did you know about it then? I think you had said that it wasn't until his third cancer development in 2009 that you had even learned about the Li Fraumeni Syndrome predisposition. So how much information did you have available to you at that time?
Absolutely nothing. So even after his osteosarcoma diagnosis, before his TP53 test, I'd never heard of Li Fraumeni syndrome. I knew what P53 was because it's the most mutated gene in cancer. It's the most studied gene of all of the genes. The reason so many people are walking around without cancer is because they've got a functioning TP53 gene. So I'd never heard of it. When they said you need to be tested for it, I knew what they were testing for, but I didn't know that this syndrome existed. I mean, at that time in the UK, there were no organizations for Li Fraumeni syndrome. Very few people had heard about it. They'd only just started publishing protocols about how to manage it and so on. In the US, there were no Li Fraumeni syndrome organizations. There are now. Thank God there are a couple of organizations in the US. What we had were some isolated Facebook groups, online kind of forums where people were finding each other, and I joined those. After George died and we wanted to do something in his name, what we decided to do was to create an organization, the George Pantziarka TP53 Trust, which is the only organization in the UK that supports families with this syndrome. And there are kind of things that we do. We provide information, we provide support, we do things that I wished we had had access to at the time. I mean, I don't want anybody else to go through the experience that we've gone through. And so that's been a key driver to try and make change. On the one side, to kind of provide that feeling of support, because people who've got Li Fraumeni syndrome, they've probably never met anybody outside close family members who've got it. I mean, in the whole of the UK, 63 million people, we think there are only about 600 diagnosed people with it. So it is incredibly rare.
I think for some of our listeners, they've probably never heard of Li Fraumeni syndrome. So can you go into that in a little bit more detail, and then also the subtypes that could be impacted, and give some guidance on Li Fraumeni syndrome?
Sure. So most people who've got Li Fraumeni syndrome inherit it from a parent, and it only needs one parent to have Li Fraumeni syndrome for a child to have a 50% chance of inheriting it. So it's not one of those genetic conditions where you need both parents to be carriers. It only needs one parent. And what it does, because the TP53 gene isn't working properly, when a cell goes bad, instead of P53 kind of kicking in and stopping that cell turning into anything dangerous, the cell just it can just progress and turn into a cancer. So the lifetime risk for someone with Li Fraumeni of developing a cancer is between 90 and 100%. And then of people who do develop a cancer, 50% of them will develop a second or third or fourth cancer. So there are people who've had 6 primary cancers in their lifetimes. So although in theory it makes a person susceptible to any cancer, there are certain cancers that are much more common in Li Fraumeni syndrome. So soft tissue and bone sarcomas, early onset breast cancer, brain tumors. So there's a spectrum of Li Fraumeni syndrome cancers, and they occur at different ages. So for young people with Li Fraumeni syndrome, there's a kind of peak in childhood where they're really susceptible to rhabdomyosarcoma, adrenocortical carcinoma, osteosarcoma, and leukemias. And then there's another peak for young women, and then it kind of, the risk drops a little bit into the 40s and 50s, and then it picks up again, and then people get leiomyosarcoma or liposarcoma or an osteosarcoma even as an adult. So sarcomas are a big thing in Li Fraumeni syndrome.
And how did you find out that George had this, and how did it impact his journey or your journey afterward?
So the fact that he'd had a third primary cancer triggered TP53 test. So there is a protocol that's, at the time it said 3 primary cancers or a family member with an early onset sarcoma. So there are all these kind of algorithm that said if you've got this, this, and this, then you should be tested. That's changing, and now for, at least in the UK and in a lot of other countries, an early onset cancer triggers a TP53 test, which means that kids are being caught with Li Fraumeni syndrome earlier, which is good.
So, based on what you know about Li Fraumeni, when do you recommend people get tested for it?
I think the testing criteria has changed a lot. So obviously, if someone's in a family that's got Li Fraumeni, they should be tested automatically, and that happens pretty much everywhere. And anyone who has a certain type of cancer at a certain age, there are kind of markers that suggest, okay, this is worth testing. So if a child has an adrenocortical carcinoma, then that they should be tested for Li Fraumeni syndrome, because a really high percentage of adrenocortical carcinomas are associated with Li Fraumeni syndrome. But most osteosarcomas or rhabdomyosarcomas aren't associated with Li Fraumeni syndrome, even at a young age. So in osteosarcoma, mainly is the most common predisposition syndrome, but it's still only a fraction of the diagnosis. Most osteosarcomas and rhabdomyosarcomas, they're what they call sporadic mutations. They're nothing to do with an underlying gene mutation. Now, as technology has changed and as genetic testing has got cheaper and improved, different countries are increasing the number of tests they're doing in children in certain populations, and they're picking up more. But on the whole, the chances are, if you've got a sarcoma, chances are you don't have Li Fraumeni syndrome.
If people were out there getting their tumor sequenced and the biomarker testing, would that be an automatic thing they would test for in all subtypes of sarcoma, in just osteo or rhabdo, or not at all?
If you tested all tumors, you'd have a huge number with TP53 mutations. The key thing is you've got to test non-tumor tissue, because if you've got Li Fraumeni syndrome, it means all the cells in your body have got a mutated TP53 gene, not just the tumor. So in lots of research studies, what they're doing now is they're testing tumor tissue and then a sample of non-tumor tissue to be able to pick up any genetic predisposition. So I do get contacted sometimes by people who've had their tumor sequenced and it's showing a TP53 mutation, and they think, oh, I must have Li Fraumeni syndrome. Mostly it's not. Mostly it's just because it's been mutated in your tumor.
Then how would I confirm if I had my tumor sequenced and I had a TP53 mutation? How do I then find out if I have Li Fraumeni?
The only way to do it would be to get a blood test where they can just check, is there something in your blood that shows that you've got a germline TP53 mutation?
And so with osteosarcoma treatment, and I know we want to get into osteosarcoma treatment from when George was being treated and even till to where we are today, and what the gains or lack thereof are. Is it something now in osteosarcoma that if someone has a T53 mutation, they would automatically test for Li Fraumeni? Are we there yet? And do we need to be there?
No, we're not there yet. Personally, I think every child with cancer ought to be tested. Traditionally, people used to say cancer is a disease of old age. And the idea is, as you get older, you have more and more mutations in your cells, and eventually one of them will go bad. And that explains why cancer is something of older age. So to me, a child with cancer, there's a question, why have they got this? What's accelerated this process? But we're not there yet, and maybe we don't need to be there. But I think as the technology improves and becomes cheaper, I don't see what we lose by doing this. The chances are we are going to find other predisposition genes, not just TP53. In terms of where osteosarcoma treatment is, at the time that George was diagnosed, the treatment had been around for 20 odd years. And if someone was diagnosed with osteosarcoma today, they will get exactly the same treatment that George had. This is one of the things that happens a lot in sarcoma, is that the huge advances we've seen in some other cancer types just haven't happened in sarcoma. So there's so much we've got to do to change that. So in osteo, there's a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, George had an osteosarcoma of the jaw, and we think there are more TP53 germline mutations in that subset of osteosarcomas. So maybe a first step would be everybody who's got an osteosarcoma in one of the rare sites, rather than the arms and the legs, which are the most common, ought to be germline tested.
And with that, my understanding has changed the treatment approach or not, since the treatments really haven't changed in
It,
however many years.
it depends, you see. Osteosarcoma doesn't get treated with radiotherapy as standard. But if there's a recurrence, it does get treated. And so there's also some evidence that some chemotherapies work better or worse. So, I mean, people are starting to look at these questions, that maybe how we can manage cancer patients with Li Fraumeni syndrome differently. But we're kind of at the early stages of that.
And I think maybe a question that some of our listeners have hearing this or from their own experiences that I imagine is coming to mind. I mean, even from me as a patient perspective, why haven't the treatments changed in so many years, in all of these decades, comparatively to other cancers? Could you talk about that for our listeners?
Yeah. So one of the issues here is that the way osteosarcoma manifests itself is different. So in breast cancer, for example, no one talks about breast cancer as a single thing anymore. You've got so many subtypes. Some of them are molecularly defined, and you can do a test, and if you've got this subtype, then you can get this treatment because it works on that subtype. But in sarcomas, that hasn't been happening because the makeup of osteosarcomas is different. There are no easily distinguished subtypes based on specific mutations or specific markers. So you end up with osteosarcomas grouped by histology and things like that, but they're not really anything that you can do anything about. There's no targeted drug that you can say, okay, it's going to work here or not. And it's not through want of trying. I mean, people have been trying, they've done all kinds of research, they've tried different things, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work in osteosarcoma because they're not defined in that way. They have high levels of chromosome damage rather than genetic mutation. So it's a different class of disease, and that's common in sarcomas. Sometimes you get some sarcomas where there's a particular gene fusion, and you can say, okay, well, this is this type of viewing sarcoma or this type of sarcoma. But for osteosarcoma, there's no fusions. There's just this chaos, really.
Yeah, that makes it hard to target.
Yeah, it makes it hard to target with a drug. So for me, one of the things that I think you have to do is maybe change your mindset and maybe banging your head against the wall looking for a molecular subtype. Maybe it's time to say, okay, we need to have a different way of approaching this. And so in sarcoma, metastasis to the lungs is the big thing, which happens in lots of sarcomas. And so maybe that's a good starting point, because for a metastasis to happen, you need to have cells go from the primary tumor released into the bloodstream or into the lymph nodes, and it's got to travel, and then it's got to lodge in the lungs, and then once it's in the lungs, it's got to get a blood supply, and it's need to get nutrients. And so there's all of these different steps that have to happen before you get metastatic disease. And all of those steps can be targeted by drugs. And so maybe one thing that we should be doing is, instead of looking at drugs to kill the primary tumor, we should be looking at drugs that stop metastasis, because the primary tumor can normally be cut out.
You know, Pan, our vision statement is people don't die from the disease.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, we would like to have a cure. Yes, we
Yeah.
would love that. But in the meantime, how do we stop people from dying from it? And you don't die from the localized disease. It's very rare to die from the local disease. It's
True.
the metastasis where we have the poorer outcomes.
Yeah. So there are a class of treatments called perioperative therapies. And the idea is that at the time of surgery, the surgeon makes an incision and the body's got to heal that incision. And so it releases all of these signals to the body. And guess what? Those are the signals that tumor cells lodged in the lungs need to wake up and do their thing. And so you can stop those signals. And there have been animal models where they've done this. There have been some early clinical trials, not in sarcomas, in pancreatic cancer, where they're doing this. And by blocking those signals, they reduce the rate of metastasis, distant recurrence. And you stop distant recurrence, you've improved overall survival. I mean, to me, it's an incredibly straightforward observation that if you stop the metastasis, you improve survival. But it's a hard message to get across.
No, you're absolutely right. And something that I want to go back to with George and his Li Fraumeni, how did you make the connection? I think you and I have had conversations, and you've mentioned the connection to his mother having it. Can you talk a little bit about how you found out and how you found out about that connection?
So it's never been confirmed, but there was no history of cancer in her family. So around 30% of people with Li Fraumeni syndrome are what's called de novo. So they didn't inherit from a parent. So the fetus, or there was something wrong with the sperm or the egg, but basically it appears from nowhere. And that person then is kind of like patient number one, and they pass it on, and it goes through the family down the generations. And so, given the fact that she had such an aggressive disease at such an early age, it would make sense then that she was a de novo patient and she passed it on to George. But we've never been able to kind of get confirmation of that, but it fits.
So you said that after George passed away, your life completely changed. And I know all of the advocacy work and how well respected you are across globally for your advocacy work. But you mentioned drug repurposing. Can you explain to our listeners how you got involved in advocacy work and some highlights of the work that you are currently even doing?
So, for those who don't know, drug repurposing is the idea that you take drugs from one disease and use them to treat another disease. And for sarcomas especially, there are so few that many companies are not developing drugs for sarcoma. So we have to, by definition, look elsewhere. And there are some examples of where non-cancer drugs have actually ended up being used to treat cancer. So a really good example is the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis is now a standard treatment for bladder cancer. So here you've got a treatment that's got nothing at all to do with being used to treat cancer, or a drug called thalidomide, which was used to treat morning sickness, and it's now a standard treatment for multiple myeloma. So we have these examples of non-cancer drugs being used to treat cancer. I mean, the latest example is baby aspirin, 100 milligram aspirin that you can get in Walgreens. It's in a clinical trial called the Alaska 2 trial. It halved the recurrence rate of colorectal cancer. I mean, halved. I mean, if that was a new drug, people, it would be, the dollar signs would be were flashing up. But it's aspirin.
Yeah.
And it's not a small effect. I mean, to reduce the recurrence rate by 50%, I mean, that's a big deal. So to me, repurposing is well established as an idea. I mean, it works. I wanted to look at that for cancer more generally. And it meant this was something that I wanted to try for George. And I found a fantastic doctor in Germany who had been using some non-cancer drugs in his clinic with really good results. And I contacted him and sent him the slides of where George was at and all the rest. And he said, I think this might work. I then took that information to our oncologist in London and said, what about this? And they said, no, we don't know how to use these drugs. I mean, these were kind of non-cancer drugs, but they weren't toxic. I mean, there wasn't anything mind-blowing in there, but it never happened for various reasons. But I became really interested in that.
It reminds me of our Vision of Hope honoree a couple of years ago at our gala, David Feigenbaum, that most people have heard of, with the book Chasing My Cure. And the interesting story about him and why we honored him is his uncle was diagnosed with sarcoma and was being treated. And David found all this information about repurposed drugs and took it to his uncle's oncologist, who at first said, no, we don't know enough about this. And it took some time for them to talk the medical oncologist into doing this treatment. And his uncle's still alive today. So one thing I want to dig into a little bit with the drug repurposing is when we treat cancer, we get so focused on the type of cancer that you have. If you have breast cancer, these are your treatments. If you have colorectal, these are your treatments. And so it seems a little foreign to some people to say, well, take a drug or a treatment that's not even for a cancer, but also why would you treat me with a breast cancer drug if I have sarcoma? Yeah. I think we'll get into the biomarkers. Yeah. But can you talk about the background to drug repurposing and why this could potentially work? And also to add to that, I know I'm throwing a lot of things on there, but I think it's really important to also maybe touch on why this would be so important for sarcoma given all the subtypes that we have.
Yeah. Okay. So the rationale is really straightforward. Cancer cell on its own can't do anything. It's a bad cell. It doesn't function properly. It produces the wrong kind of proteins, but on its own, it doesn't do anything. A tumor is this big collection of cancer cells, but mixed in there, you've got some immune cells, you've got some stromal cells, all of these non-cancer cells, all working together in this big lump. And it needs a blood supply to get nutrients. Cancer cells are incredibly greedy for nutrition. They're so greedy, they produce all of these waste products that have to be cleared. So you get a buildup of what's called an acidic microenvironment. So the whole tumor is a big system of cells. And these non-cancer drugs, they affect some of those systems. And so it's like a war. If you've got an invading army and it doesn't have any supply lines and can't get ammunition, you can defeat an army that way. So drug repurposing, you're often taking drugs that are used to treat a completely different disease, but they depend on some of the same pathways as cancer cells do and as tumor cells do. So the idea is, in biology, you see the same drivers in lots of different diseases. Chronic inflammation is implicated in arthritis, it's in diabetes. So what you're doing is targeting those with these old drugs. So for Li Fraumeni syndrome, one of the things that we are doing, we're running a clinical trial in the UK. It's our first clinical trial anywhere in the world, looking to see if we can reduce the cancer incidence in people with Li Fraumeni syndrome. And for that, we're using a drug called metformin, which I take for type 2 diabetes. It's a really common, cheap drug. But in mouse models of Li Fraumeni syndrome, it affects the metabolism of cells in such a way that the cells don't turn into tumor cells. And in mice, daily metformin reduced cancer incidence by 30%, which is a really big deal for people who live with Li Fraumeni syndrome. So we're testing that in Li Fraumeni syndrome in the UK, but there are other trials in actually treating cancer, not just for prevention, but there are trials treating cancers, including sarcomas, using non-cancer drugs. And one of the things that I do is I maintain a database of these trials where there are currently 900 plus clinical trials ongoing looking at non-cancer drugs to treat cancer. So we're not talking about treating the symptoms of cancer or being used as a diagnostic or anything like that. We're talking about taking non-cancer drugs and using them to treat cancer. 900 trials, including some which are at phase 3. So these are not just early. So I'm really hopeful. And for sarcomas, we already know that for some rare sarcomas like EHE, the drug of choice is a drug called sirolimus, which is used to treat kidney transplant rejection. So nothing to do with cancer, but we've got really fantastic evidence, and we've been working with PUSH and SFA and working with the European Medicines Agency, the kind of European FDA, to try and get this drug approved. But it's a drug that's, decades old, nothing to do with cancer.
And for sarcoma, given the fact that we have so many subtypes, it seems insurmountable to think that we are going to have research and drug development and approvals for over 100 different subtypes to come to fruition. I mean, when I think about it, even with SFA's role in the research space and the drug development space, we have to think outside the box. And as I wrote in my newsletter article, going through the window, right? We have to think a little bit differently and create a different future for what it might look like for patients with sarcoma, and drug repurposing is one of those areas that shows a great deal of promise.
Yeah, I agree. Think about it. If in sarcoma, so that thing that we see in osteosarcoma, the metastases to the lungs, that happens in so many soft tissue and bone sarcomas. Now, if we could tackle that, just that process of tumor cells lodging in the lungs, turning into a metastatic lesion there, if we could target that, that would apply across so many subtypes. And the thing about it is, because you're not targeting the cancer cells directly, but that process of going to the lungs, it doesn't matter what the primary tumor is. So in some ways, it's a subtype agnostic process that cuts down the risk of metastases, which is what kills most patients.
Yeah, that's a good point. So outside of the drug repurposing, what other things are you working on, Pan? Because I know it's a lot. I mean, yeah, I guess you don't have to give us the whole list, but some of the highlights of things that you are affecting change, not just in Europe, but also helping with SFA globally to affect change.
Sure. So one of the things that I'm involved in is the FOSTER Consortium, which is a European osteosarcoma collaboration, the first European collaboration for decades. And that's got a clinical trial testing a new maintenance treatment. So at the moment, everybody gets their neoadjuvant chemo, surgery, adjuvant chemo, and then you finish, and that's the end. And a big percentage of people at the end of that process will end up getting distant recurrence. So what we're doing there is testing a drug which isn't normally used in osteosarcoma as a maintenance treatment at the end. So I'm really hopeful that is a way of reducing that distant recurrence. Foster's based in Europe, but we're already getting interest from Australia and Japan and other countries. I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be a US arm of Foster. I mean, if we could have a global collaboration for osteosarcoma, I mean, we need to think big if we're going to make a difference to diseases that haven't changed in decades. So Foster for me is a really important thing. And I'm really happy that SFA are kind of really supportive of Foster and the work in Foster. PUSH is another one. PUSH stands for Pushing Ultra Rare Sarcomas Beyond Hope. And it's a collaboration that's going to be looking at lots of these ultra rare subtypes. But when we talk, I mean, all sarcomas are rare, but ultra rare, you're talking about less than 1 in a million. So there might only be a couple of hundred patients of one of these ultra rare sarcomas in the whole of the US, for example. That's a patient population that makes it incredibly difficult for researchers, for trialists. No drug company can afford to spend billions developing a drug for a patient population that small. So PUSH is bringing the whole community together to focus on different ultra rare sarcomas, working together to kind of plug the gaps in the knowledge that's missing, because very often for these ultra rare sarcomas, we don't actually know what treatment there is, because there are so few patients, there's no standard guidelines for them. We don't know what works or what doesn't work. So we need to just collect what's happening now on the ground to build up a picture. When we talk to the regulators and say we think this drug is going to be good, they're going to say, well, how do we know the drug is having an effect? What happens to this disease without the drug? And we can't answer those questions. So PUSH is really important. And the fact that SFA is taking a leading role in PUSH, I think it speaks volumes about the global vision of the organization. So PUSH is a really big deal. It's going to make a huge difference to those patients. Now, you know, they're ultra rare, but there are so many of them that if you count up the number of patients, it's quite a significant body of people to kind of say you've all got an ultra rare. They might all be different, but they've all got the challenges and all need support.
Pan, one of the things that you said when we asked you what resources were important to you as you were going through the journey with George, and you said PubMed.
Yeah.
I know there are listeners out here who maybe feel intimidated, even from some of our education webinars that we host that are really science based. And we sometimes get feedback of that was over my head. But we see it as, but these are things you need to know.
Yeah.
And so, what guidance would you give or thoughts to people listening and saying, don't be afraid of the scientific information? Because you yourself didn't have a background in this when you got involved in it.
No, absolutely not. You need to have a thick skin. I realized that at a certain point that I didn't care if I asked a stupid question. As far as I'm concerned, there are no stupid questions. So the second thing is that there's always somebody you can ask who can help. Struggling on your own can only get you so far. So I was shameless. I would reach out to people and ask questions. I think there are a lot more resources now. I think some of the AI models are actually quite good. You can ask quite detailed questions, but even within those, if it gets too much, reach out and ask. The research community itself, what I've seen in the last 15 years, a much greater willingness to engage with patients. There is no research projects that can go ahead these days without patient engagement. Now, it used to be patient engagement was just like a tick box. Yeah, checked it, I've done that. But actually now I think it's much more real. And so we're desperately short of patients and patient advocates who want to progress and take part and kind of make things better. So I'd really encourage people to kind of find resources and kind of improve their knowledge to help themselves and actually help the whole sarcoma community to kind of progress. We really could do with more help.
Yeah, absolutely. Pan, something that's been kind of a byline and something you mentioned before recording is that throughout the journey, there have always been more questions than answers. And as a scientist and a parent, you want answers. And I feel that most people impacted by sarcoma feel similar, like so many questions, not enough answers. And it can be daunting facing something that has more questions than answers. So how do you stay hopeful?
I stay hopeful because I can actually see things like push happening. The fact that people are willing to come together and work collaboratively to solve problems that affect patients in a really deep way. The worst thing is when people are closed off in their little silos and don't want to work with anyone else. We're not going to make progress in that way. Science is a group effort, and that group effort has got to include patients and patient advocates.
Absolutely. Pan, we have two final questions that we always ask. And the first one is, you've talked about so many important things, but if you could leave one message or piece of advice with listeners, what would that be?
I think the advice is learn as much as you can, because the more you learn, ideas will occur to you that maybe have not occurred to anybody else. The thing that surprised me was when I was looking at learning stuff about oncology and trying to understand everything, I kept asking these questions because I saw it didn't make sense. And I thought maybe it was because I was just missing key information. And I ended up writing a paper on Li Fraumeni Syndrome, which I never imagined doing, but it made a contribution. People can make contributions in all kinds of ways. Sometimes people have been asked to review documents, patient information sheet, and so the first time someone does that as a patient advocate, they're just really nervous. Oh, God, am I the right person? And then they read something and it doesn't make sense to them. Well, that's so important, because if it doesn't make sense to you, the chances are it's not going to make sense to anybody else. And if a clinical trial is trying to recruit patients and people are looking at this information and it makes no sense, that trial is not going to go anywhere. So everybody can help. And really, it's not everyone's got the appetite. And for those people who never want to look at cancer again after they've been through this, it makes perfect sense. But if you've got the willingness to do it and the time to do it, just get involved, because you can make a difference, even if it's only a tiny difference. Lots of small differences soon add up.
Yeah, that's great advice. There's room for everybody who wants to get involved to use their skill set in whatever way they want to. Pan, if listeners wanted to continue to follow your work and your journey or get in touch, is there a way for them to do that?
I'm contributing to the SFA newsletter, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But they can contact me via SFA or via the George Pantziarka TP53 Trust. And I'm always happy to hear from people.
Amazing. Well, Pan, thank you so much again for your time on the podcast this evening for you. For our listeners, Pan is based in the UK, so we've been watching the sun go down as he's been talking. So we're going to let him go. But thank you so much, Pan, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking with you in this capacity.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity.
I'm so thankful to have you part of the SFA team, to be able to share your passion, your knowledge on behalf of our entire community to improve outcomes. So thank you, Pan.
Thanks, Brandy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us today. Did this episode resonate with you? You can join the discussion about this episode in our Sarcoma Stories Facebook group, linked in the show notes. If you found this podcast helpful, your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps to create more awareness about sarcoma while sharing vital resources with someone who may need it. Be sure to leave a rating and review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.